What is up, everyone? Welcome to the Phone with Friends podcast. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. I'm your host, Allie. Joining me on today's episode is Lillian. And Lillian is the founder of In Retrospect Writing Services, and she does copywriting. She's also a publicist and does social media strategy, to name a few things of the many things that she does. First off, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Absolutely.
So Lillian's joining me today to talk about marketing and publicity advice and tips for small businesses and creatives, as well as podcasters. So I'm very excited to have you on the podcast because I do think that there are a lot of small business owners and creatives and podcasters out there that may not know or may not have a lot of experience when it comes to how to market themselves and how to use social media and kind of what the benefits are of being able to create like social media campaigns around episode launches and products that they have coming out and things like that. So I'm really excited to hear about a lot of the great tips and advice that you have when it comes to marketing and getting yourself out there. So again, thank you very much for being on the episode today.
Absolutely happy to be here.
If you could share a little bit about yourself and your background, that would be amazing. And then I'm really interested to learn more about how you got into copywriting and marketing and publicity.
Sure, yeah. I was born and raised in Vancouver, BC as a first-generation Chinese Canadian. My parents immigrated to Canada ages ago. And growing up, actually, my first real exposure to writing was just through all the books that I used to read, and I love creative writing. Actually, eons ago, I was published. I had a couple short stories published.
Oh, wow.
In a couple of anthologies back when I was in high school. And my family, especially since this was pre-internet days and pre-self-publishing days, had always said to me, oh, I don't know, I don't think you're going to be making that much money working as a novelist, right? And when I got into university, I actually had only declared an English major. And everybody said, oh, so are you going to teach? And I said, well, I don't have any real desire to teach English. What else is out there that I could kind of get into? And I saw that my alma mater had a communications program that looked really interesting. And I said, how about I tack that on as my major, as one of my double majors? And I started getting exposed to critical thinking in terms of analyzing advertising. So stuff like everything that you see on TV, hear on the radio, see in magazines, you start to really sort of understand the psychology of why brands choose to use everything from the images they use to the copy that they use and everything else. So I thought, hey, you know what? I've always been creative, but how about I use that creativity on a bit of a business slant and I start working with people on how to creatively put their story out there in advertising and through media and communications. So when I added on to my major and started doing communications, in Canada we have what's known as co-op, so that is paid internship experiences.
Oh, nice.
So I said, okay, if I want actual real world experience in this, then I need to be able to show people what it is that I can do. So believe it or not, In Retrospect Writing Services actually started because I needed portfolio pieces in order to get hired for these paid internships, in order to have a portfolio to show people what I could do. So I basically all I started doing was I put together a resume and I started back in the day cold calling and cold emailing as many businesses and as many agencies as I could to try and get some experience. And as luck would have it, I got some paid experience through my first ever ad agency that I worked with. And basically the rest is history. I've just sort of built on that and kept working with not just agencies, but some great solopreneurs and different brands in like food and beverage, tourism and hospitality, indie film and television, and just kept growing on that and adding to my skill set. I added publicity to my list of services about 6 years ago now as a way of expanding on the product suite that I was offering to clients, and also learning the ropes on how to manage media relations and getting press coverage and everything. And it's been a ton of fun.
Yeah, I love that what started as kind of a way for you to build your portfolio has kind of blossomed or bloomed into this business that you run. Like, that's really cool. And also, I love how internships require you to have experience before you can do them. I've always enjoyed that about internships.
Yeah.
I really love that something that you were so passionate about, even as like a child, you were able to kind of morph and find a way to incorporate it into your day-to-day work. Like, that's really cool. I don't think a lot of people kind of have that same experience. So that's really awesome that you were able to kind of identify that early on and then find ways to kind of keep that going in what you do. And so you kind of mentioned you do a little bit of everything, and I know you've worked on a couple of different campaigns, which you kind of mentioned when it comes to like publicity. You've worked on indie films.
More so just on like the indie film and television side. Like, usually when my clients have a film festival that they're premiering in, I'll do the publicity for that. Like last year, I had a client who managed to get into Comic-Con in San Diego, and she was screening her film there. And I had a week and a half to put together a campaign for her as a way of getting press for Comic-Con as the final push to get distribution for her short film. So I put it together in a week and a half, managed to get a ton of great press from a lot of different genre media and online media, because it was a horror film. So a lot of horror film media outlets helped share the news and everything. And that kind of helped to put together the final push in order for her to get distribution. So the film's now on Shudder because we worked together to kind of put that campaign together in a week and a half for Comic-Con. And I've done just a myriad of other things. Like, I did worked for a software company that was managing the online web presence and online store for Pamela Anderson back in the day. So one of the things I had to do, because she was announcing the launch of a new perfume, was to develop the copy and do all the testing for an email campaign to send out to all her subscribers and everything. Well, I guess it worked, because within the first 4 days, they sold out of everything. So we had to go in and manage the customer service side and make sure all the emails were updated and everything. So it was very interesting to kind of step into that and going, oh, okay, so I'm doing email campaigns for celebrities now. All right, let's just roll with this and see where it goes.
That's so cool. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Yeah, I can't imagine what that's like. I bet it kind of keeps the job interesting, because you really don't know what's coming your way. It might be, like you said, an email campaign for perfume, or like, I can't believe you put together an entire campaign in a week and a half for Comic-Con. Like, that's pretty amazing. But also, like, how cool, how fun is that?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I love that you get to be creative like all the time. And that was something that I also really like about what you do, is you focus on the storytelling and the sharing of your like clients' stories, and use that as a way to not only bring in clients, but to keep them coming back. I think that is an issue that small businesses have, is they may be able to get clients, but then it's like, how do you keep them coming back? Like, what tools are out there that you can use to tell your story and to draw in clients and then continue to have them come back for more?
Sure, yeah. I think it really comes down to, first of all, what is your story, right? Mm-hmm. You need to really pinpoint what it is that makes you unique, makes you different, makes you stand out, and why you want people to know, number one. And number two, what I've noticed, at least with a lot of the clients that I work with that are on sort of the product and the service side, as opposed to projects like film, is that they tend to spend something like 4 or 5 paragraphs on their website, let's say, talking about their background and how they came up with the idea or the product and what it looks like and how it works. And what it comes down to is you have to narrow it down to 2 things. There's, what do you want people to know about you and how you came up with this idea? And number 2, how does your idea, your product, your service benefit the end consumer? How are you addressing their pain points? How are you helping solve their problems? In other words, if they were to look at what it is that you're putting forward, they would ask, okay, that's great, but how does it help me? What's in it for me, right? And I think that's the piece that a lot of businesses are missing, because once you nail all of that down, then it's just a question of what mediums do I want to use to share that? Do I want to put out an e-newsletter? Do I want to do a short video for social media? Do I want to do a quote image post? Do I want to do a blog post? Then it becomes a lot easier to figure out what mediums you have in front of you, what platforms you have in front of you, and which ones you want to use. Because the other part of it that I come across a lot of small businesses and solopreneurs is that they spread themselves way too thin as well. And by that, I mean, they're on Snapchat, they're on TikTok, they're on Facebook, they're on Instagram. Like, just because a platform is there, that doesn't mean that it's going to work for your business, that your audience is going to be on that platform, or that you have the time or the energy to devote to another 3 or 4 platforms, when really using the first 3 would work just fine, right? So that's kind of one of the big mistakes that I see a lot of businesses making, which also delves into not having a plan. Going into marketing and communications and any kind of advertising and not having a plan for A, what do you want to do? B, what's your budget to do that? And C, what tools, resources do you have at your disposal to do it, either do it yourself or bring someone in to help you out to create that content? Because when you don't have a plan, that's where you make a ton of mistakes. That's where your engagement that you have, doesn't matter how many people are commenting and sharing what you're posting up there, if you're not making any sales out of it ultimately, right? Yeah. Either making sales or building relationships with the key people that you want to eventually get sales from, like one or the other, and they tend to go hand in hand as well.
I can, speaking from my personal experience, I guess that's definitely something I know I've run into a lot, is getting overwhelmed, because like you said, there are so many social media platforms out there, and when you start to look at it and how much time you need to devote to each one, it can get insanely overwhelming. So in your opinion, besides kind of not having a plan going into, marketing your small business and, spreading yourself too thin on social media, what are some of the other biggest mistakes that small businesses make when it comes to utilizing social media and marketing?
Probably within the last, I'd say 4 to 5 months, I think I've seen a lot of small businesses immediately jump into the advertising side of things. Now, advertising, particularly if you're doing digital advertising, does have its place in a marketing strategy. And I would never say absolutely don't do it, but I typically don't recommend it to my clients right off the bat, because I tell them, not only are you paying money up front, you have to be really clear about what your goals are and how you want to achieve them first. It's definitely a lot more time consuming and certainly more effort to do things organically. Put up the organic content, make sure that you're using the correct hashtags and making an effort to engage with people than it is just paying for an ad. The other thing is that advertising is very much a one-way type of marketing. Mm-hmm. You put out an ad and people either respond to it or they don't, but you're not actually building a relationship with them. You're just trying to get to your website or wherever it is to try and gain sales. And the problem with delving right into advertising right away is also that, well, you don't have organic content to show people. They don't know really what it is that you're about or exactly what it is that you do and why they should care ultimately. Especially since they see a lot of advertising on literally every social media platform there is. Yeah. There's really nothing that tells them what really distinguishes you from someone else. And it's one of those things where I think that, you're putting more money into it upfront. And once again, you're not developing a cohesive strategy, because advertising, just like the rest of marketing, doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's only ever going to be successful if you develop a cohesive strategy that incorporates that into what you're already doing. And there's a reason why, even as you are preparing to, say, do an advertising campaign, they tell you, if you're going to, say, boost a post, do it with one that you already have a lot of organic engagement with, because it shows. It shows that you already have that history of people engaging and who are responding to what you're putting out there, instead of just having something completely blank and brand new that no one's looked at, no one's engaged with, and you're hoping and praying to make sales out of it.
Yeah, that's definitely something I hadn't thought about before, but that makes sense, because if it's kind of goes back to like building trust with potential clients or customers. Like if they've already engaged with you and you already have posts up, they can kind of see what you're about, and you're building that trust and that engagement with them. And I hadn't thought about the boosting of posts that already have a lot of engagement on them. That's another really great tip. I hadn't considered that at all, but it makes a lot of sense to do it that way, rather than post something new that no one's seen or had time to engage with, and kind of just crossing your fingers and hoping that that something comes out of it. Do you have I'm going rogue a little bit.
Okay.
When it comes to so we're kind of talking about like small businesses, which I think of like makers or creatives as small businesses, because most of us are. But when it comes to folks who are, they're making things like I've seen a lot of people doing like resin art, or you're a knitter and you're selling, I don't know, maybe you knit tops or something like that. I'm assuming like the fundamentals of marketing it's kind of the same across. But I guess, do you have any advice specifically for folks that are makers or creatives, like maybe they're illustrators or do artwork and stuff like that, versus kind of like a service-based small business?
Sure, yeah. For anything that's creative, where you're coming up with a product, whether it's a design, or like you're making bookmarks, or you do crochet, there's definitely certain platforms that would work better for that. Things like Instagram and Facebook would probably work better for you, and developing an Instagram or a Facebook shop would work better for you, as opposed to, say, working on Twitter. So there's certain things that, depending on the industry that they're in, the marketing strategy will change a little bit in terms of which platforms you should focus on. But the overall strategy, when it comes to content, there's always going to be, okay, your visual content versus your written content. With your visual content, your images, and if you want to do video, then it's a matter of developing ideas on, I just finished a project, what sort of image can I put together that's going to show people exactly what it looks like, and the different angles and the lighting and everything. The other part of it is, do I want to do a how-to video?
And doing kind of like Instagram videos and things like that are definite things that people who are makers should consider doing.
Yeah, because it really brings people into your process and what makes your process unique, and kind of gives them an inside look on all of the work that you do, and makes them appreciate sort of the hand craftsmanship that goes into all of these different pieces that you're creating. And I think that definitely works better for makers and creatives, as opposed to someone who's running more of a service-based business, because it's hard to have a visual representation of a service you're providing. That's more something that's a little bit more text-based, more written testimonial-based, or even a video testimonial-based, whereas makers can really kind of get creative on developing their visual content. How they want to do image collages is a big one, that would look great, that will show people the process of like step 1 to step 10 on how you create something. How-to videos are really big. tutorials on showing people, teaching them how to make certain things, I've found is also really big, particularly within the last few months. A lot of people have been hopping online and, doing online cooking classes and learning how to crochet and doing all of that sort of thing to learn a new skill set. So these are all ways that creatives and makers can really sort of dig into what it is that they do and get people engaging with their content, because they can look at a video, a how-to video, and ask them questions on like, oh, I usually get stuck when I get up to this part. Do you have any tips for me to get past that? Or, hey, this looks great. Maybe they'd want to send in their videos to, someone who's teaching knitting or someone who's teaching like metal work in a shop. And you all of a sudden develop this like online sort of classroom community, even with fans of yours who would then, love your work so much that they're recommending you to friends and buying your stuff and everything. Because I know it's a lot tougher right now with a lot of these makers and creatives not having in-person marketplaces. And having the online marketplace and putting up a product page makes it easier for people to shop, but you miss that connection component. And I think that connection component can really come from posting this type of interactive content where people really dig into how you're doing things and they can ask you questions to learn from you too.
I have seen a little bit of that on actually on TikTok. I think is becoming quite popular with makers as well. I know I follow like quite a few like small businesses and makers on there, and they do a lot of kind of what you were talking about, like how-to videos or tutorials and or behind the scenes videos and things like that. So I know I find them I find them entertaining, and I enjoy them very much.
Hey there, Rainbow Warriors. It's me, CJ, host of Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBT. I have sprinkled myself with protective glitter and jumped upon my trusty unicorn to bring stories of the LGBTQI. Whether you belong to this community or not, I welcome you to take a listen to Beyond the Rainbow. I have all sorts of crazy, chilling, and horrifying stories I tell. It's available almost everywhere you listen to podcasts. Still not sure I'm worth a listen? Then check out my website at beyondtherainbowpodcast.com. And remember, it's not a crime to be gay. Unless you're a murderer.
We've talked about small businesses a little bit and being a creative, and something else I wanted to touch on, maybe a little bit for selfish reasons because I am a podcaster myself. I did want to touch a little bit on how podcasters can market themselves, because like I'm in a lot of podcast communities, I guess, on social media, especially on Twitter. Again, just in my own personal experience, Twitter seems to be kind of the social media platform for podcasts. We all seem to do fairly well there. And it's one of the only platforms that I see people asking for podcast recommendations on. Mm-hmm. But a lot of us still, we're small podcasts or indie podcasts. So I've reached out to the podcast community, I guess, that the communities I'm in, and kind of asked them what some of their questions were when it came to marketing. And one of the main questions was, how can podcasters kind of mobilize their fan base to essentially do the marketing for them? So when it comes to promoting the podcast and kind of recommending it to their peers, as well as kind of creating that buzz around a podcast, what's a good way for podcasters to kind of embolden their listeners to do that?
It's in some ways, it's actually really similar in terms of a marketing framework compared to your typical small business. Like, for example, if someone buys something from you and you want to have their loyalty, you would do things like thank them for their purchase, keep note of when their birthdays are and send them birthday deals and special discounts, maybe give them discounts on things that you've bought before. Now, when it comes to a podcast, just looking at some of the ones that I interact with, there's a really great one, a Canadian true crime one known as Dark Poutine. And Mike and Scott do a great job of not just doing the typical Patreon perks, things like shout outs to fans who give them donut money on PayPal and who give them monthly, donations and things like that. And they sell merchandise. They give their Patreons exclusive access to behind the scenes footage and allow them to ask them questions. They do AMAs a lot. Now, I know that a lot of this is dependent on A, how big your podcast is in terms of audience, and B, also how much time and bandwidth you have to do this promotion too. But if there's one thing that I find that works really well is developing your own community of listeners, and you open that group and then you promote it on your podcast and go, hey, join the rest of however many fans you have on Facebook or wherever it is that you're putting the community, on Slack, to chat about, the topics that we've covered or a case that we've covered, or in your case, talking about travel stories, personalized travel stories, whether to use a travel agent or not, or things like how do I travel safely during the time of a pandemic, like all of these different conversation topics, and allow them to sort of build their own community around the topics that you're sharing with them on a weekly or bi-monthly, however often you choose to post an episode. I know that some of the larger podcasts can certainly give them more content, more behind the scenes content, allow them to have a little bit more input on the podcast, like even doing a live Q&A session to answer questions they might have, and then taking those questions and developing episodes out of them. There's definitely no shortage to the amount of things that you can do. It's just a matter of how big your current audience is based on the promotion that you're doing currently, and also how much bandwidth you have to undertake a lot of this, because it does definitely take a lot of time. And for podcasts that only have one host as opposed to having two, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
It really is. So that's just a few of the ideas that I've come across, and certainly seen podcasts that I follow make really good use of them. And what ends up happening then is that you build a community that's several thousand strong from literally all over the world.
Yeah, I know Patreon or creating Patreons is very popular with podcasters, and some of the other podcasts in the community are definitely opening up some of those. I've been thinking about it. I've definitely heard like various things. Like some folks say that, they recommend you have at least like 1,000 subscribers or listeners before you open up a Patreon and stuff like that. So I'm kind of like, do I, don't I? But yeah, I guess there's no harm in opening one up and just seeing kind of who comes or not, and then like go from there. But I like the idea of creating kind of a forum around episodes and kind of encouraging that community conversation. I think I could maybe do that with mine. Maybe. One of the other questions that we got was, and this is something that I have also not struggled with, but it's something that I've attempted to do, and I haven't had very much luck. But how can podcasters get sponsors, or do you have any advice for podcasters that are looking to get sponsors? A lot of us use various hosting platforms where they actually will find sponsors for you.
Yeah.
Once you have like a certain number in your listenership. But like I personally, there were 3 brands that I really wanted to have as sponsors because they really, meshed well with my podcast and kind of the story I was trying to tell with my podcast. And I was also subscribed to their services, like I was a big fan of these businesses. And so I put together kind of like a media kit, my listeners and downloads and all the information about the podcast and like a proposal essentially, and sent it out to these 3 businesses. And no one bit, but that's okay. But I guess, do you have any advice for kind of how we can, how podcasters can get out there and maybe get sponsors?
Well, there's a couple of different things you could do. Certainly the way that you chose to go about it might be the best way to kind of find brands that really align with your content and your beliefs and sort of the type of things that you want to be sharing on the podcast, doing your own research and coming up with different brands that you could approach with a media kit, and also, just information about what the podcast is about and also what you're about is probably, I would say, the most cost-effective way of doing it, even if it does take a little bit more time. The other part of it is places like Podbean and Knit Audio, and also iHeartMedia, Acast, places like that have ads marketplaces that you can go take a look at that have brands that are open to putting ads on podcasts, and looking at how you can work together with the brands that they have listed on there to develop an agreement that works for both sides. The other part of it is that for anybody who wants to get into the sponsorship and advertising side of things, the general rule of thumb is that you don't use more of 10% of your airtime for an episode on that. So if your episode's like half an hour long, you really shouldn't be spending more than 3 minutes on promoting a sponsor, because then that's a way to have your listeners drop off and they stop paying attention and things like that. So those are all things to kind of keep in mind. And I know you said that a lot of podcasts are on networks already, but there's definitely some of the more well-known ones like Podcast One and Ringer and Earwolf and guys like that really can give you a little bit more exposure because they have a name behind them. That if a particular brand knew that you were syndicating on that network, then they might be more likely to kind of jump on you, as opposed to you just recording yourself and sending it out on Apple and Stitcher and that sort of thing. I know that there's other services like hosting platforms like Audio Boom that will help you find sponsors, but you do have to get to a particular threshold first in terms of the number of downloads and subscribers that you have. So there's definitely ways in which that you could go about doing that. I would suggest that if you're the most cost-effective way is probably looking at the ad marketplaces, maybe looking at another podcast network, and also doing your own research into brands that you might like to work with. They say that it's definitely easier to approach a brand who already has a track record of working with podcasts because they know how it works. They know, generally speaking, what the agreements would entail and also what the costs would be for them to have an ad on your podcast. The other way that you could go about it is that there are hosted ads that you could do where you could have another podcast come in and say sponsor an episode, and then you do the same for them. So you're doing sort of a more there's no money exchanging hands, but you're doing a more reciprocated sort of sponsorship situation where you both do that for each other. So there's definitely a couple of different options there in terms of getting sponsors. Definitely be prepared with an agreement and a media kit if the brands that you're approaching don't have any experience with that. But there's definitely a lot of brands that are on those ad marketplaces, like on iHeartMedia and also on Podbean, that you could definitely choose from. Like there's hundreds, if not thousands, and just making sure that you have all of your ducks in a row in terms of everything that you want to send them when you're pitching them, I think is the key thing.
For the listeners, because you can't see me, I am scribbling madly in a notebook, taking notes. So that's why there's a pause there, because I'm trying to write down for my own use later. But yeah, those are all fantastic tips. And I know that's one of the things I kind of recommend to podcasters is, well, I mean, you kind of recommend it for when it comes to marketing always, is kind of like find your people and find your community. And I found that when it comes to podcasting, that's been probably the number one thing that has helped my own podcast has been being in those communities and cross promotion and doing like episode swaps. And as you said, like sharing promos and each other's episodes and things like that. Like, I think that has been one of the best things about being in a podcast community, but also just, sharing tips and helping each other out has been also very amazing. So if you're a podcaster, highly recommend finding a community of podcasters that you can join, because it has done wonders for me, especially on social media, and my listens have gone up. Speaking of listeners, do you have any other tips or advice for podcasters when it comes to getting listeners and then keeping them coming back for more episodes, kind of the same as you would want to do if you were a small business, to keep your customers coming back to you?
Yeah, it can definitely come down to how you choose to promo an episode. I've noticed you're doing this really well, and there's definitely other podcasts that I follow that are doing this, but audiograms on either Twitter or Instagram are really good, because it'll give listeners a snippet of an episode. Mm-hmm. So it gives them a little bit of a taste of an episode, between 1 to 2 minutes long, that they can kind of get the gist of what an episode's about, and then it can help entice them to go and listen to the full episode. So I think it's really good, and it also helps to promote the episode in a auditory way, instead of just posting a link to the full episode. People actually get to learn a little bit more about what you're talking about at a given time in an episode. They can see some images, so they have an idea of who you're talking about, as opposed to just going to a link and clicking on the audio file. I think it also comes down to what kind of perks, again, going back to building that fan base, that you can give your listeners. There's a lot of people that do the Patreon thing. They do the fan shout outs. They ask for donations. They take voicemails from their fans, so their fans can kind of call them up and give them their opinions on the latest episode. They sell merchandise. They do a lot of just interactivity things to make sure that their fans are appreciated, number one. And number two, they also solicit feedback from them too, right? You can do a Q&A episode and ask them, what do you want to see more of? What do you want to see less of? Is there something that you think we should have covered already that we haven't? And sometimes it's a little bit easier depending on what the topic is, or what the focus is of your podcast. Like for true crime, as I'm sure you know, there are thousands of cases worldwide all the time. It's up to you on basically which one you cover, when you cover it. And for something like your podcast and dealing with a lot of travel topics, it is pretty much the sky's the limit in terms of what people could learn from in regards to how to travel safer, how to travel better, how to travel more affordably, how to develop different itineraries, and make every destination fit for you, no matter what kind of traveler you are, things like that. Yeah. But really, definitely making an effort to, number one, show your listeners that they are appreciated, and then number two, soliciting their feedback and their engagement every so often lets them know that you care about their opinion as well. And I think that's really important to really build that engaged community of listeners who will not only come back and listen to your episodes, hopefully come back and re-listen to your archives as well, but also recommend it to people. You're right in saying that Twitter is one of the few platforms where people are asking for podcast recommendations, but there's times where that'll come up in a Facebook group too, because they're interested in learning more about what's out there in terms of podcasts that focus on a particular subject. And who knows, that might even give you some ideas on things that you might want to cover down the road as well. If there's other recommendations of other podcasts that come up with, like, hey, they just covered, I don't know, like how to develop an itinerary for people who want to backpack through Europe. And that's something that you haven't covered. But, you can listen to that episode and go, oh, hey, I got some ideas from this for an upcoming episode. So it's very much a reciprocated community, I find, no matter what the topic is your podcast is focused on, as opposed to we're competing with each other for a share of the audience. Because I certainly listen to a variety of different podcasts, and these are like you would never think, for example, an interview podcast would have had to compete with my attention when it came to a true crime podcast. They're two very, very different things.
Yeah.
But I think that what works really well for this community is that there are enough listeners that are interested in a wide variety of things that you can pretty much appeal. There's basically no struggle or fear of running out of listeners.
They just released the new numbers. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but essentially podcast listenership is just going up and has continued to go up. And especially now with the coronavirus or COVID-19, it's actually increased quite a bit more. So yeah, like you said, I don't think there's any worry about running out of listeners, which is amazing. But yeah, it's exactly like you said, like that's another reason why I like the podcast community so much, is because it's not about the competition. It's about how can we work together to kind of like promote each other and get the word out and help each other out and get each other listeners. And so that's something that I really kind of love about the podcast community. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about publicity and press coverage. And then we will get to the bucket list activity questions.
If you're like me and you're just getting started with podcasting, it can be scary and overwhelming. That's why Anchor is such a great choice. It's one of the easiest ways to make a podcast, and best of all, it's free. It also has great creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. Another great feature of Anchor is that they'll distribute your podcast for you. Your listeners will be able to access your podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many others. You can also make money from your podcast using Anchor, and that's with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place, and it's easy to use. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today.
And we're back with Lillian from In Retrospect Writing Services. We've covered a lot of material in this episode. We've talked about kind of marketing tips and strategies for small businesses and creatives, as well as podcasters, which of course, I'm super excited. I can't wait to apply some of those tips myself. And so something else I wanted to touch on quickly was publicity and kind of press coverage. Because I know that's something else you mentioned that you have done as well with indie films and television shows and a variety of other events like Comic-Con. When it comes to press coverage, especially when you're a business or a podcaster, do you have any advice for how to get press coverage? Or, it's something that I know very little about. It's from like a podcasting perspective, but I guess do you have any advice or kind of tips on how to get press coverage or when you should get it?
Sure, yeah. It's one of those things where you have to, once again, go in prepared. So things like putting together your media kit is vital. And usually things in a case of a podcast, I would suggest would be, high-res headshot of the host or hosts, synopsis on the actual podcast, and then a little bit of the statistics and everything on what your listenership and everything is at. And also maybe a couple of key episodes that have been really popular with your listeners is a good thing to throw in there, because the media is going to want to know not only what your reach is, but what topics you're an expert on and those ones that are really popular with your audience. And then when you're looking at researching into different publications and other media outlets that might be beneficial for you to, say, interview on or for them to mention your podcast on, it comes down to what industry your podcast is in. What industry, and also things like women in business is huge. So for any women that are podcast hosts out there, that's definitely an angle that you could look at approaching and doing research into those publications and those outlets on having an interview done and everything. So that's all your it's basically building your media contact database is what it is focusing on what industry your podcast is in. And then if you're branching out for that, then it's a matter of looking at different story angles. Like if you're a female host, then there's a women in business angle there. If you are someone who identifies as a minority and your podcast is all about different ethnic cuisines, well, then that is a huge market of media that you could look at, because you're not just approaching food and beverage related publications, but you're looking at writers who have specifically focused on different types of ethnic cuisine. So a lot of it is really about, once again, drilling down to what your brand story is and who you are and what your focus is, and then looking at who out there kind of matches up with that focus. And when you pitch them, it's basically about developing a pitch that kind of outlines who you are, what your idea is. Like, say, you want to get some press coverage because your milestone episode's coming up. You are coming up on episode 500, let's say, and you have some great guests lined up for it. That's a reason to get some press coverage in order to hopefully gain some new listeners who are going to want to listen to your milestone episode when you have some pretty important guests on there. Things like that. Anything new is a great reason to get press. So, a milestone episode, if you're doing some kind of expansion where you are expanding the business to include merchandise and other perks for fans, and absolutely if you are going to a related event. Up here in Vancouver, there's a lot of podcasters that will go to the PodFest portion of the Vancouver Podcast Festival. And what that is they set up a table and they get to meet members of the general public who talk to them about what their podcast is about and everything. You're basically an exhibitor at an event like that. That's a great reason to get press, is if you're going to be an exhibitor at an event like that, or if you might be speaking, you might be presenting at an event like that, talking to people about how to develop a podcast and how to turn, say, there's a lot of conversations around anyone who used to be a journalist and how you turn the journalism narrative, the narratives that you used to cover as a reporter, into podcast episodes. Last year, I went to a talk given by John, who is the host and creator of the Dirty John podcast. And he used to work, a number of years reporting on these types of crimes for the LA Times, right? So opportunities like that are great reasons to kind of go out and get some press coverage and get people excited about seeing you speak at the event, or tuning into a milestone episode. There's always got to be some sort of reason to kind of bring the media in that they're going to want to cover it.
Do you recommend, or I guess is it advised? So like when I think about doing something like that, like in my mind, I'm like, well, I'm like this really small podcast. I don't have like a lot of listeners. Are the media going to be interested in like this little podcast that's does it typically work out, I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you have to have a lot of listeners in order to be able to kind of get that publicity, or is it really just all about how you put yourself out there and present yourself?
A lot of times it really is not about the number of audiences that you have, because I work with a lot of indie films, and most of these indie films, for example, do not have big A-list Hollywood actors in them. They don't. And yet I'm still able to get press for them. And how does that work? Well, it comes down to the story and what the hook is, what your reason is for bringing them in. Are you speaking at a key event? Are you announcing a milestone episode where you're going to be having some important guests? There's always a particular hook that you can come up with in order to develop a story for the media to want to cover. It really has nothing to do with, I only have 3,000 downloads this month. That's just giving them a little bit of extra info to kind of contextualize what your podcast is about, but it shouldn't stop you from approaching them. It's all about developing what that hook is and where that story is and why they should care. Like, are you partnering up with a major event? Are you launching something new that in partnership with a particular company or a major event that they're going to want to care about? And that happens all the time with businesses and podcasts that you might think that have tons of people listening, but really have a much smaller audience than you think they do. But they're able to get that coverage because they have that hook that people buy into, and that they look at it and go, oh, our listeners or our readers or our viewers are really going to want to learn more about this because it's a key event in our city, or it's a key event in this particular industry. Because when you're involved with things like that, you also can't always rely on the event to mention you in their news coverage, in their press release. So you have to kind of do it on your own and say, by the way, I'm partnering up with event X to do this, and this is my experience with it. This is, why I'm doing it. I think a lot of people could learn from it. Things like that. There's always a hook out there. It's just a matter of finding it.
It all goes back to the storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So much great advice in this episode. Like, honestly, like I said, I'm kind of scribbling madly in my notebook as we talk because you have so many amazing tips. Before I wrap everything up with Lillian, I do like to ask kind of a final question, because the podcast is really about getting out there and trying new things and pushing yourself. So one of the things I like to ask my guests is, what is one thing that you've always wanted to do, so kind of like a bucket list item, that you haven't done yet, and what do you think is holding you back? And it can be anything, it can be travel related, it can be about personal growth, or learning a new skill or language.
A couple of things. One of my travel bucket list activities would probably be going to Spain and learning how to make authentic paella. This is one of my absolute favorite dishes, and I've always wanted to learn how to make it. But of course, with everything going on this year, international travel is not exactly advisable, right? So
yeah,
it's still on the list. So we'll see when I'll be able to cross it off. But it's definitely one of those activities where I'm like, if I ever do make it to Spain, I definitely have to cross that off, because you can't go to Spain and not have paella. You know what I mean? That's like going to China and not having Chinese food. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I'm like, for me, it's like you can't go to Spain and not have kava or wine. But yeah, I feel you 100%. That's a good one.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that I've always had the hope to do is that I hope to be able to be financially independent enough that I can put together a couple of trust funds for. I've got 2 nephews and a niece. And I'd like to make it so that my brother and sister, and also my sister-in-law, aren't worried about where to send their kids for school, or if they want to use it for travel for a gap year or go into the trades, whatever it is that they want to do. I want to be able to help support them in that, because education, for me, no matter how you get it, whether it's in a university setting or not, is really important. And I want to be able to see those kids have opportunities, the same opportunities I had, and even better than that.
That's a really good one. I think you might be the first person who's ever had a bucket list item like that before. That's a really good one. Yeah, that's so sweet. That's a really good one. I really like that one. That's good. Well, on that lovely note, I really want to thank you so much for being on the podcast with me. I've absolutely loved learning so much today from you about marketing and kind of hearing all of your advice and your tips. So thank you again so much for joining me today, Lillian. And I know that there are other podcasters and creatives and small businesses out there that will definitely get a lot out of this. So thank you again very much.
Yeah, happy to help. I definitely hope that I've been able to help somebody come together with a marketing strategy and figure out how to best do things for their podcast or for their business. And that's my philosophy, is that I'm always here to help them figure that out.
If folks have additional questions or would like to get in touch with you, where or how is a good way for them to do that?
Sure, yeah. My Instagram handle is lsu30, all one word, 30, so 30, lsu30. On Twitter, I am lsu23, so lsu23, which is, I came up with that because I'm a lifelong Michael Jordan fan, so
nice.
lsu23. And then my website is, in retrospect, writingservices.com. So that's INRETROSPECT, writingservices.com, all one word.
I will definitely include all of Lillian's information in the episode description. And Lillian and I will also be doing a live Q&A where she can answer any marketing questions you have or publicity questions. And we will be doing that the week after this episode airs. So keep an eye out for that. You can send your questions into me through email, funfriendspodcast@gmail.com. Of course, you can do it through Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You can also send me voice messages through Anchor FM, and I will include all that information as well in the episode description. So feel free to write in any questions you have or leave us a voicemail, and we will answer those during that live Q&A session. And with that, I want to say thanks again so much, Lillian. This has been absolutely fantastic. And for everyone listening, get out there, try something new, and have some fun. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. Be sure to check out the Fun with Friends podcast on social media. We are on Instagram @FunWithFriendsPodcast. You can also find us on Twitter @FunFriendsPod1. You can also reach me by email at funfriendspodcast@gmail.com. And you can go to my website, cootscreations.com, for some fun little extras from the podcast. So definitely head over there and check it out. And as always, remember to get out there, try something new, and have some fun. Goodbye.